Sorry, I did. I practiced clicking, going back and forth before I even started this, and thought I had it figured out, but obviously I didn't. So this will be part two of lecture one of week three. My apologies, and hopefully I can avoid doing this again. Um, the debates over what constitutes Augustinianism, how do we define it, have been going on since the Augustinianismus was formulated in the 1880s. Okay, now there have been like 5 different definitions, at least, if not more, uses of the term, and so scholars have debated, as I think I just mentioned early on, different concepts. And they use, even though they attack each other, and they use it to interpret what's going on, but they're not clear with their definitions. And most of my work has been to try to bring some sort of order to the whole debate. Now, the Augustinian Renaissance concept was drawing on some of the previous debates, including the work of Damasus Trapp, whom I mentioned in the introduction. And Heiko combined two concepts or 2 different definitions kind of Augustinianism. One of the things that Trapp did in this article I didn't understand the first time I read it was to point to a significant increase among members of the Augustinian hermits in their knowledge and use of Augustine, beginning in the 1340s. These are the university theologians at Paris for the order, starting with Gregory of Rimini, basically, as the first one who is the first, as Trapp said, the first Augustinian theologian of Augustine. That's another issue there. And then it continued following Gregory with Alphonsus Vargas, Huguelinus of Orvieto, and John of Basel. So there was a series of Augustinian theologians who had studied Augustine thoroughly, knew Augustine better than anybody else. That was Trapp's position. But unfortunately, that scholarly erudition for Trapp ended with the Great Schism. Now, I mentioned the Great Schism, I believe, in Chapter 1 of Lutheran Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. I'll be talking about that either next week or the week thereafter. I forget when it is exactly. But it was a major event, and it did have a major impact. So for Trapp, this rebirth or this renewed Augustinian scholarship, looking at the text, going back and finding more texts and knowing them backwards and forwards and more thoroughly and more specifically than anybody had before, was a development from approximately, let's say, 1340 to 1378. So it was a very short-lived phenomenon. Now, that concept became taken out of Trapp's original discussion and became applied to the influence of Augustine as such in the later Middle Ages. And what Obermann did was combine Trapp's scholarly erudition with respect to Augustine's texts with a renewed campaign he saw against the modern Pelagians. Now, I'll be talking about Pelagianism and Pelagius in the next slide to give some context there. But we do find certainly, both among Augustinian hermits and a couple of theologians who were not Augustinian hermits, a sense of there's a threat to theology. That is that we have an emerging new Pelagians. The Pelagius, we'll talk about a little bit briefly more, was a theologian at the same time as Augustine. He was a little bit younger, back in the 5th century, late 4th, 5th century, and they had a major debate, the Pelagian controversy back with Augustine and Pelagius, and then with some of Pelagius's followers, especially Julian of Eclanum. I'll be addressing some of those issues involved there in the next slide. But that's what Obermann saw, because Luther condemns people as being Pelagian. He talks about the new Pelagians, the Pelagians. And so it's like this Pelagian threat whereas Luther then reasserts Augustinian theology. And that has been argued as being one of the origins of Luther's Reformation theology, was his response to the perceived threat of a new Pelagianism. So Obermann sees the relationship between this campaign against the modern Pelagians that led to this scholarly erudition that Trapp talked about, and then he fuses the two and talks about it being a renaissance of Augustinianism, the late medieval Augustinian Renaissance. Now, it also has connotations with the Italian Renaissance, which we're not going to go into here today, or probably even later, maybe a little bit later, because there was some connections, very close connections between the Augustinian hermits and some of the Italian humanists, some of them, not all that many, but some, Petrarch especially. And so there's a sense of going back to the sources. That's one of the hallmarks of Renaissance humanism in the Italian Renaissance, is the return to the classical sources. We have to go back to the original manuscripts, not just reading quotable quotes or collections of citations and quotes, but actually going back to the original manuscripts. But Trapp even suggested this already. That's what the Augustinians were doing with Augustine, and they were doing so, at the same time, if not before, what the Italian humanists were doing. So Obermann kind of brings in that too and uses the term Renaissance, therefore, talking about the Augustinian Renaissance, and on it goes. So that's why I bring that problem up now. So that's how Obermann put it together. So when I use the term the Augustinian Renaissance, it's within this context of, first of all, Obermann, who was my teacher, the larger discussion that's been going on since the late 19th century over what is Augustinianism, and the even larger than perspective of what is the relationship between Luther and Middle Ages and Luther and early modernity. Was Luther the person who ushered in modernity, or was he simply the culmination of the medieval tradition? How does that all fit together? What do we make of this figure, Martin Luther, and what he unleashed? That is where this term, the Augustinian Renaissance, comes into play. I have used that actually to critique Obermann, for whom he's my mentor, my advisor. I don't even begin to put myself in the same league with him in any way, shape, or form. But yet I critique him. I disagree with him, and he passed away in 2002. But I would tell him right now, if he came back and say, Heiko, you're just wrong. I'm sorry, you're wrong about this. Anyway, but that's a lot of, you'll see when you go through reading more about Lutheran Reformation of the later Middle Ages, my dialogue partner, so to speak, often is Obermann. So that's two I wanted to bring in here to put the context of that. My point, essentially, has been that the debate has been over a theological or philosophical definition as opposed to an historical definition. And I want to bring it back to an historical definition. And was there, for example, a definition of being an Augustinian? Let's leave the ismus out for a minute, but being the adjective, what did it mean to be Augustinian? Not in our terms, in terms of, oh, that's Augustinian, because that's based on how we interpret Augustine, but in terms of the time in themselves. How did they understand the use of the term? How did the people in the 14th century, whether it's the Hermits or anybody else, how did they understand the word Augustinian? And Augustinianism didn't exist, but Augustinian did. How do we understand that? And what impact did that understanding have on the development of the time? That has been my project. And I'll be talking about that the further we go, which then, seeing it in those terms, also places the whole development in different light in terms of the development of the impact of Augustine in the later Middle Ages and the relationship to Luther. So that's why I think it's so exciting. And what I argue in Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages is that Luther was very much a part of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, even though he did not know that much about his own order's traditions, but we'll get there in time. Okay, that being said, Let me see where we are now. It says complete confusion, a new beginning. That's what I've tried to offer in my work for the Augustinian tradition, for Augustinianism. I have up there too, right before that on the slide, before the complete confusion, the problem with isms, Augustinianism, and nominalism. I'm not going to talk about nominalism. You may come across it, you may see it in the Lutheran Reformation of the Later Middle Ages book. You may have already heard about it. It too is a very controversial term. With different meanings, and people throw it around and use it without really understanding what it refers to. Luther calls himself a nominalist, but it gets very complex. If you're interested in that, just let me know, and I'll happily try to explain more about it. But in terms of this lecture, and in terms of the course as such, the way I have it constructed, nominalism doesn't come into play. Now, that's something that the Heiko would be saying, "No, you're wrong, Eric. How can you be my student and not talk about nominalism?" Because he was very big on nominalism. But it's too complex at this point and doesn't really yield much. It doesn't help explain much. If I need to bring it in later, I will. If it's in the book, at least I wanted to address what it means. It is a philosophical position on the question of universals, the truth, the good, the just, where they are names, not things themselves. And then in the 15th century German universities, it became an institutional distinction and became associated with what was called the Via Moderna, which was an institutional structure within German universities in the 15th century. And Luther was a member of the Via Moderna, and therefore it was seen as, therefore he's a nominalist. It gets very complex. Some of that is important. Also, I talk more about that in a couple of the chapters of the Lutheran and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages that I have not assigned to you, Luther's ways of thought, because they're really go into the details of some of the arcane debates over Luther's philosophical and theological development, also with respect to nominalism. I thought I'm not going to assign those. Those are important, obviously. I wouldn't have put them in there. Important for Luther scholars, for that interpretation of Luther, that deeper level. But at this stage, it doesn't help much. So there's no reason to assign that here now. But if you're interested, please do read them. If you have any questions, please do ask me. We can go from there. Now, that all being said, we can move on then to Pelagianism, and this is still kind of background. But we won't understand this Augustinian Renaissance concept without having some kind of understanding about Pelagianism, which is important for as we go along too. Now, I'll try to keep this as short and concise as possible too. Pelagius was a British monk, contemporary of Augustine's. Of course, a little bit younger than Augustine. And he was a very committed Christian. He traveled from the British Isles. I forgot where he was based in England or in Britain, to Rome. And what he saw in Rome shocked him. He said, "You know what? These Christians aren't living Christian lives. This is a real problem. How can we not kind of put our money where our mouth is? If we're supposed to be good Christians, we should be good Christians." Now, he had read some of Augustine's earlier works and even went to try to meet with him once. And Augustine was away at Carthage and they did not meet. But Pelagius liked and was very impressed with some of Augustine's earlier works until he read the Confessions. Confessions were fine until in Book 10, Augustine repeats, I think 7 or 8 times, beseeching God, grant what you command and command what you will. Grant what you command and command what you will. Pelagius thought, that's ridiculous. How can this great scholar Augustine say that? That absolves humans from any kind of responsibility, that undermines all morality. And what Pelagius saw was rampant immorality in Rome. And he developed a position that, you know what? Humans are responsible beings. We earn our salvation. We earn our salvation by how morally responsible we are. So, God gave us a command. Christ said, "Be ye perfect, even if your Father in heaven, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." And Pelagius argued, he said, "You know what? Jesus would not give us a command that we could not fulfill." He doesn't say, "Grow wings and fly." He says, "Be ye perfect." Therefore, we can be perfect. And so, Augustine, your assertion that we have to pray for God to grant us what God commands of us undermines all moral responsibility, all ethics, all achievement, all merit. Now, Pelagius has been seen sometimes as the position of we completely merit and earn our salvation without grace. That was not really his position. Grace was something that was a given. Creation is great, God's grace. Then there's the fall from grace with Adam and Eve, being kicked out of paradise and all those things. But there is still God's general grace that's there. Then the problem is, what do we do with it? Now that gets us to the issue of, and the central issue of the debate between Augustine and Pelagius is their concepts of original sin, and the state of sin. For Pelagius, original sin was simply Adam and Eve. There's no such thing as the state of sin, except for the fact that after Adam and Eve, we live in a fallen state. However, all of us are in the same position as Adam and Eve. We can all choose to sin or choose not to sin. That was Pelagius's position. That was the position that, so that's what Adam and Eve were in paradise. They had the choice to sin or not to sin. God says, "Do not eat of the fruit of the tree of life. Anything else you can, but don't do that." And what do? They go and do it. But they didn't have to do it. They chose to do it. Under the influence of the serpent, of course, and it gets very problematic and theological and all those other things. For Augustine, however, who has been accredited with having developed, if not originated, the doctrine of original sin, the fall of Adam and Eve for Augustine was the fall of all humanity and all of nature. Everything fell because it was the corruption of God's intended created order. It's not that simply we're in an altered, fallen state. We are so corrupted by sin, we cannot not sin. Before the fall, for Augustine, he agreed with Pelagius. Adam and Eve could have sinned or not sinned. After the fall, Augustine argued, humans cannot not sin. Even in all the good work we do, there's still sin. Because what is sin? Sin is being turned in upon yourself. It's self-will, self-desire. It says, and we can't get rid of that. We live not just in a fallen state, but in a sinful state, which is defined as alienation from God. We were completely focused on God. That's why God created us. We would walk with God. And what did we do? We sinned, we turned away, we tried to hide. After Adam and Eve eat the apple, God comes to walk with them again in the garden, and Adam and Eve go, "Uh-oh, number one, we're naked. Oops. And we have to hide from God. Oops." We're alienated from that communion. And for Augustine, there's nothing we can do about it. We are turned in upon ourselves, incurvata in sese, the phrase he used, and we cannot straighten ourselves out. That's the problem. The real problem for Augustine is the original sin and then being in a state of sin. Are there sins within the state of sin? Oh, yes. But they're not that big of a deal. I mean, some of them could be, not too nice. We shouldn't commit murder. We shouldn't commit adultery, all those things. We know how we should live. But that's not an issue of salvation. Salvation is only coming when God can straighten us out, and we cannot do that on our own. Now, I could continue a lot about trying to argue for one position or the other, but it's an option. Augustine says we can't be perfect. Pelagius says, yes, we can. That doesn't mean that Augustine said that there was no such thing as morality, or that we shouldn't strive to do the right thing, and that we shouldn't strive not to sin. Any good that we do, if we give to charity, if we give alms, that's good, and we should. There's still self-will in it, because how many of you, if you ever give to charity, feel good about it? Anyway, the point being, I'm not going to start arguing for Augustine's, and just to be clear, I'm on Augustine's side. In many ways, I'm a 14th century Augustinian hermit myself, as I've joked before, just simply one living now in the 21st century, married with children. So that's another issue. But these are two options. Is Christianity to be a religion or a faith? I'll get back to that distinction shortly. Of the perfect, those who are the elite and can only be perfect, or is it to be for everybody? And Augustine will say, we're all sinners. It doesn't matter. We're all sinners. There's nothing we can do about it. We all miss the mark. And we can't hit that mark on our own. Only with God's help, only with God's grace. And therefore, we are all deserving of eternal punishment. That was the wages of sinners, death. And Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise. We're here. What's going to happen when we die? Well, in a state of sin, you go to hell. I'm not going to go into all those different issues right here and now. That would take the rest of the lecture, and then some in 2 and 3 and 4 other lectures as well, to explicate the theological positions and reasoning back and forth. But whereas Pelagius said, okay, there's grace, but then it's like the free will and what we do with it, and on that basis we get to heaven, if we do. For Augustine, it's like, first, no, God has to grant us the grace, has to predestine us for salvation. Now, predestination has, that's why we need to get into all this, and predestination is a very complex doctrine. It is unavoidable because Paul talks about predestination. Those whom he predestined, he also justified, and on we go in Romans. So Christian theologians had to deal with it. Often they didn't deal with it very well. Augustine really focuses on it. And I really can't spend much more time right here and now talking about it. It's very important because the Pauline, Augustinian, Luther, and Calvin line have focused on predestination. And that has had a major impact on how they've developed, and also the movements stemming from them, especially Luther and Calvin. When we get to Calvin, I'll be talking a lot more about that. I'll talk more about predestination when we get there too. It's not only the doctrine, it's also the misunderstanding of the doctrine. But we'll get there when we get there with Calvin. But for Augustine, it all comes from God's grace. We can't save ourselves. We have done nothing worthy. We are in a state of sin, turning it upon ourselves. And even if we do good and do good things and do good works, when Augustine says, yes, we also have to preach morality. We also have to preach to do the right thing. But that's not about salvation. That's about living the Christian life. How do we live the Christian life? We don't know if we're predestined or not. We can never know, and we won't know until we get there. Because it's an atemporal thing. God is atemporal. Heaven is atemporal. That means not in temporality. There's no before and after with God. There's simply an eternal presence that we can't know till we get there. We certainly can't point to people and say, I'm predestined, but you're not. Therefore, you're going to hell. Therefore, we can treat you as we want. That was definitely not the Augustinian position, or the Pauline position, or the Calvin's position. Again, we'll get there when we get there. These are issues, though, that do impinge upon